might wind through here, but 104,000 did pay their respects to the president. At a certain point, we will see this casket transferred to a hearse, and it will slowly make its way over the Washington National Cathedral, where the president will be eulogized.
And the Washington National Cathedral is a scene where there have been so many memorable moments in the nation's history. It's about a 4.5-mile drive from Capitol Hill over to Northwest Washington, where the National Cathedral is located. This is the National Cathedral, the second largest cathedral in the United States. The state funeral, what exactly is a state funeral? It's an event that occurs very rarely in U.S. history. The last time this has occurred, more than 30 years ago, when Lyndon Baines Johnson was accorded the result, all the honors of a state funeral. Jeff Greenfield is watching all of this with us as well.
Well, if this is the end of this tradition, the end of this ceremony, the state funeral actually encompasses this line in state and the rotunda and the final services. It's also an event that uniquely, in a way, connects past and present and future. When Abe Lincoln's funeral train passed through New York City, one of the people who witnessed it was 6-year-old Theodore Roosevelt. And as it passed through Buffalo, one of the people who visited it was future President Grover Cleveland. And I think you can say it's a fair bet that somewhere out there is a young child who will be witnessing this event today, who may someday wind up as President of the United States, and one of his or her memories will be the state funeral of Ronald Reagan.
We're just beginning to see the cathedral fill up. We're told that Nancy Reagan will have some 1,000 friends in attendance, and some 3,000 dignitaries will also join in watching the service. Among those who will be eulogizing former President Ronald Reagan, the current President of the United States, George W. Bush, his father, George Herbert Walker Bush, the former Prime Minister of Canada, Brian Mulroney, and Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, who has had several really bad months, suffered a series of minor strokes. And it is our understanding that she recorded this eulogy on videotape just about 2-3 months ago.
Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan share a political legacy. They both had to challenge their own party leadership, their more moderate members, to win their party's designation. They launched together an aggressive battle against the Soviet Empire, one that ended with success. So they really were partners for years, Wolf.
What we're seeing now on this split screen, the U.S. Capitol, that is the hearse. That will carry the casket of Ronald Reagan's body to the National Cathedral. You're looking on the right part of your screen at the National Cathedral. It's about a 4.5-mile journey through the streets of Washington, D.C. This motorcade will go approximately, indeed precisely, 20 miles per hour as it makes that journey through Washington to the National Cathedral. Interestingly enough, the former U.S. Senator John Danforth, Paula, is going to be officiating at this formal service. It begins around 11:30 this morning here in Washington, Eastern Time. Billy Graham, the Reverend Billy Graham, had been the first choice, but unfortunately his health clearly has not been up to it. So Senator John Danforth, who has just been nominated, just been named by the president to become the next United States ambassador to the United Nations, and is an Episcopal priest himself, he will lead this memorial service.
We also want to give you a sense of who, other than the folks we just mentioned, will be attending the services today. Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, the former Soviet premier who made history with Ronald Reagan, Lech Walesa of Poland, Gerhard Schroeder of Germany. You were talking a little bit earlier, Wolf, about the president of South Africa, who will also be in attendance.
Thabo Mbeki making a very beautiful gesture on behalf of the people of South Africa, coming to the United States to meet and to represent the emotions that are felt there, Jeff.
That is a really remarkable gesture, because Ronald Reagan did not have a good relationship with the African National Congress. They felt that he was too kind to the white minority government of South Africa for a time, his policy of constructive engagement. But clearly this is a reconciliation gesture on the part of the president of South Africa, and that ought to mean something. That ought to show you that with the passage of time, some of the intense political battles on the international scene tend to fade, and instead the United States, and now a black majority democratic South Africa, are allies.
The casket will leave the Rotunda, Capitol Hill, and eventually heading here, the picture that we're seeing over at the National Cathedral. Mrs. Reagan, Nancy Reagan, has spent the past night over at the Blair House, the official residence for guests of the president. You're seeing this picture of Mrs. Reagan with Major General Galen Jackman. He's the U.S. military escort who's been with her since Sunday, the day after her husband died. This is a dramatic moment that all of us remember when she went into the rotunda and spent a moment with her. Well, this is actually a live picture that we're seeing right now. She has returned to the rotunda to spend another moment or so with the casket.
A number of Mrs. Reagan's friends are quoted in the newspaper today saying, the Washington Post at least, this will be the most difficult day that she will endure. Your heart goes out to her when you see the tremendous strain on her face.
Her beloved Ronnie, as she called him, her beloved Ronnie. That was such a touching moment, Jeff, when we saw her actually kiss that American flag. The American flag that flew over the U.S. Capitol on the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, January 20th, 1981.
There was a letter that ran a couple of days ago when Ronald Reagan must have been in his 40s, visiting New York, and a letter he wrote to Nancy explaining how he felt she was with him. And it was the letter of a young couple very much in love, and may I say in a delicate way, in every sense of the word. He missed her spiritually, and he missed her in other ways, and he told her in very polite but very clear language exactly how much he missed her and how he felt her with her. I don't think anyone of any persuasion can look at this decades-long relationship and see Mrs. Reagan now and not realize for all the last 10 years he's been taken from her by Alzheimer's. This is the last moment she will have with him.
In spite of the fact that she's had 10 years to prepare herself for his end, once again her friends are saying she's having a great deal of difficulty letting go.
Judy Woodruff is over at the National Cathedral. Judy, set the scene. What are you seeing?
Wolf, I am actually sitting a few blocks from the cathedral. We chose this location because it was the closest we could get from a security standpoint, and right now you can hear one of what must be 20 or 30 or more motorcades that have come by. The security is just tremendous. I actually live not too far from the cathedral, and I've never seen the area closed off, this wide an area around the cathedral closed off in all the years that I've lived in Washington. We are going to be seeing, as you've been saying, world leaders. We are going to be seeing people who may have disagreed with Ronald Reagan on the world stage, but who are come together with him. But we're also going to be seeing political leaders in this country who don't agree, never agreed with the bulk of Ronald Reagan's philosophy, but they are here to pay their respects. Bill Clinton, the former president, will be here. Al Gore, former President Jimmy Carter, his vice president Walter Mondale. Both of them were defeated by Ronald Reagan in general elections in 1980, of course, in 1984. We are going to see a parade of Democrats and Republicans coming together in a week when partisan politics is just off the table. They may go right back to it next week, but this week it has receded into the background because they all have come together to say that this was a man who made a difference in the lives of Americans and in the life of America.
I'm just looking at a live picture of Rudy Giuliani and the back of his wife's head, Judith Nathan. We're to understand that he did have some private time with the Reagan family yesterday.
And on the left part of our screen, Paula, we're seeing this color guard begin to move up the stairs toward the rotunda to begin the process of removing the casket of Ronald Reagan from the rotunda and bring him down to a hearse that will carry him. Mrs. Reagan will be in a separate limousine with her military escort, Major General Galen Jackman, and they will drive the short distance from Capitol Hill over to the National Cathedral. This is a very, very carefully choreographed process, Paula. Every step literally has been worked out well in advance.
And that's no surprise when you have a 130-page manual guiding you on the steps that need to be taken during a state funeral. It's interesting to note that all presidents in the last year of the presidency are asked to file a funeral plan. I think we're just seeing former President Jimmy Carter there, and I believe I just made out Rosalind there in the right section of your screen.
The former Vice President of the United States standing by with Tricia Nixon, looks like.
Walter Mondale was probably the one man who can say clearly, I defeated Ronald Reagan in a political debate, in that first 1984 debate. That set the stage for one of Ronald Reagan's iconic political moments when he came back and promised not to use his opponent's youth and inexperience against him. And there was a two-shot after that of Walter Mondale cracking up in laughter. And I have to believe at that moment, former Vice President Mondale may have been saying to himself, you know, this is over.
Because Reagan ended up crushing him, right? 49 states.
So much for that issue. Lost 49 states, barely won his own state of Minnesota. He felt the full force of just how powerful Ronald Reagan was.
And Jeff and Paula, when you think about it, that Jimmy Carter has come to Washington, Bill Clinton, Gerald Ford, first President Bush, and we see Walter Mondale, other political adversaries, to at least on this day, the country is coming closer together.
And all but Bill Clinton ran against Ronald Reagan. Bush ran against him in the primary. Ford in '76 was almost unseated, and of course Carter and Mondale. So except for Bill Clinton, who was, I guess, just too young and was spared that, all of them felt the power of Ronald Reagan as a political force, and as you say, well, they're all here to pay their last respects.
I don't think any of us, Paula, should necessarily get carried away and think this era of goodwill is going to continue in the political scene much longer than today and tomorrow.
You're seeing UN Secretary General Kofi Annan now come into the cathedral, and we'll continue now to see dignitaries pour in as we are
Silvio Berlusconi, the Prime Minister of Italy, who was at the G8 summit near Savannah, Georgia, Sea Island, Georgia. He, together with Gerhard Schroeder and other leaders, have come. Interestingly enough, though, the French president, Jacques Chirac, decided to fly back to Paris instead of coming to Washington to participate. The source of, I guess, Jeff, some consternation out there that Chirac decided, in effect, I don't know if it's fair to say he's snubbing the United States, but to at least send that message that he's got other things he wants to do.
Well, you made a prediction on the air yesterday. It was borne out that among the more conservative talk radio and television folks, there would be some umbrage taken at that, and I was actually checking to see just how shrewd you were, Wolf, and you were exactly right. They are taking this as a sign of displeasure with President Bush. The argument is, look, the people who served with Ronald Reagan during his tenure are the appropriate people to come and mark his passing.
And one of the most appropriate people to come will be Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, and Prince Charles is going to be here as well. Obviously, the United States and Britain, Paul, are the two closest of allies, and that is being underscored by their participation, as well as Lady Thatcher, who is here as well.
A lot of people were surprised that Margaret Thatcher made this trip. We mentioned a little bit earlier on her eulogy to President Reagan is on tape, but her doctors have banned her from all public speaking and most travel. So for her to make this long trip here and then to accompany Nancy Reagan later today back for the burial in California says a lot about the strength of that bond.
I think it also says a lot about their effort. They want to help strengthen Nancy Reagan right now during these difficult days. They just want to make this statement as we see Tony Blair and his wife Cherie walking in to the National Cathedral.
The interesting thing, I think, about both Prince Charles and Prime Minister Blair coming here is that the United States has an unusual government. That is, the head of government's also the head of state. We obviously don't have royalty. But in most of Europe, the person who runs the government is the prime minister, and the president is sometimes ceremonial. Here, we combine both those roles, so it is actually appropriate for the British to send their head of government and perhaps the heir to the head of state, Prince Charles and Tony Blair, because that's two different functions that we wrap in one.
The crowd is going to be more than 3,000. The National Cathedral can hold as many as 4,000. Former Vice President Al Gore and Tipper walking in as well, once again underscoring this historic day in the United States when everyone is almost coming together to receive, to honor the former president. On the left part of the screen, what we're seeing are some of the pallbearers who will be part of the formal ceremony that will bring the late president of the United States to the National Cathedral. Some of the closest personal friends of Nancy Reagan and President Reagan. Paula, let's go through who those pallbearers are.
Well, we just saw Merv Griffin, who is an old friend of President Reagan's, obviously a Hollywood legend as a producer. John Hutton, who was formerly a general in the armed forces and attached to the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. He happened to be one of President Reagan's personal physicians. Frederick Ryan, who was the chairman of the board of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and Charles Wick, who is also a Hollywood veteran. He's a writer, producer of shows like, or movies that is, like Snow White and Three Stooges, and knew the president well.
He was the director of the USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, during all 8 years of Ronald Reagan's presidency. And let's not forget Mike Deaver, of course, the former White House aide, one of the media consultants who was so close to the president. There he is, right in the middle of the screen, right there. Mike Deaver standing next to Fred Ryan, who was the chief of staff.
Bill Bennett on the right part of your screen, President Reagan's education secretary.
And drug czar, someone who was close to the Reagans, clearly influenced by the Reagans. And there he is, Kofi Annan, the United Nations Secretary General, who has come to pay his respects as well. So much of the world, Jeff, has come here today.
I was remembering, I guess inevitably, the scene from John Kennedy's funeral when so many of the world leaders, most imposingly French President Charles de Gaulle, walked behind in the funeral cortege. This is obviously a very different occasion, but it would be hard to think of a recent American president who had more impact on the world stage than Ronald Reagan. There's fundamental reshaping of alliances and confrontations.
We're just seeing members of the Reagan family reposition themselves around the U.S. Capitol, we assume, to watch the casket be put on the hearse to travel to the National Cathedral. Patty Davis, Ron Reagan there. There's been a lot of talk about how Patty Davis's relationship has changed over the years, particularly after she had to accept her father's illness. There was great tension in that relationship, and she has written quite poignantly over the last several years about how her father's challenge brought the two of them closer together. We had a photographer on last night who, for 30 years, captured images of Ronald Reagan, not only as president, but even in his campaign as he ran for governor. And there were a number of shots of him, the president, or then gubernatorial candidate, holding children. And he talked about how that was highly intimidating to Ronald Reagan's children because they had to accept that that was time away from them.
That's Michael Reagan, also in the middle of the screen next to Patty Davis. And Dory is Ron Reagan's wife next to Ron Reagan. Our viewers are seeing the Reagan family. They are there up on Capitol Hill right now, getting ready for this next step. The military color guard going into the rotunda to begin the process of taking that casket, the flag-draped casket, removing it and carrying it to the hearse that will drive the former president of the United States to the National Cathedral. It's been empty now for about an hour or so, the rotunda, but more than 100,000 people managed to walk through in the past day or so and pay their personal respects. Another 100,000 had done so at the Presidential Library in Simi Valley earlier. This is a moment, Jeff, for Americans to sort of reflect and cherish what's going on.
We're a country that was born in rebellion against royalty and pomp and circumstance. Maybe it's played at high school graduations, that we claim not to like it, and yet the very fact that we don't have a royal family, we don't have nobility, makes moments like these particularly special. They're the closest thing we have to the kinds of ceremonies that were very and are very common in Europe. This is the sort of stuff that people, as I said earlier, are going to remember. You know, older people talk about where they were when Roosevelt died, or what they remember about seeing a famous person either pass through alive or dead. So I think you're right. I think this is one of those moments that people say, all right, even though we're a country born for the common folk, there is a reason why we commemorate with this kind of pageantry.
One of the things that struck me are the number of young people that came to pay their respects to Ronald Reagan, and I'm talking about teenagers, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And when we interviewed them, they all said that there was something very appealing to them about Ronald Reagan, even though many of them weren't around when he was president, because he was so optimistic and made them believe in America.
Let's watch this ceremony take place, this next stage.
Ready, 2. Ready, 2. Ready, 2. Colors, about. Colors.
Attention! Who?
The family of Ronald Reagan waiting for the casket to come down these stairs. There's the back. From the back you see Mrs. Reagan accompanied by her military escort, the family to her right, to the right of our screen. This casket will be brought into the hearse for the drive over to the National Cathedral. Paula, there will be a 21-gun salute as part of this formal ceremony as the casket is carried down the house steps and loaded into the hearse.
And the trip from the Rotunda to the National Cathedral is a short one, just about 4.5 miles. The weather has kind of turned here in Washington. Originally, government officials thought that since this is a national holiday, with the government pretty much shut down, that you would see throngs of people as the hearse made its way to the cathedral. But with drizzle, I don't know about that.
The limousine carrying Nancy Reagan, the limousine that will follow the hearse from Capitol Hill to the National Cathedral. On this day, overcast a little bit. You can see the drizzle beginning to come down. It had been sunny and hot when this casket arrived here in Washington. Now the clouds beginning to open up just a little bit. As we watch this motorcade begin the process of driving 4.5 miles from Capitol Hill to the National Cathedral, our senior White House correspondent John King is at the White House. John, I take it the president has just departed?
43rd president has just departed. Wolf, his motorcade now headed for the National Cathedral. In that motorcade, the First Lady Laura Bush, also the 41st president of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was, of course, Ronald Reagan's vice president for 8 years. Both Presidents Bush will deliver eulogies today at the National Cathedral. The current president ran through his with his staff about an hour ago now. We're told he had a final walkthrough and read-through of his eulogy. Aides say it will run about 15 minutes, while the former President Bush will deliver more personal reflections on Ronald Reagan. The current President Bush, we are told, wants more to reflect on what he believes Ronald Reagan meant to the country and to the world. The president will describe Ronald Reagan as someone who brought optimism and patriotism back to America, we are told. He spent about 40 minutes with Nancy Reagan last night after going up to the Capitol Rotunda to pay respects. White House Communications Director Dan Bartlett telling me a short time ago that he cherished the opportunity he and Mrs. Bush had with Mrs. Reagan last night. He called it a time of reflection on a great man and comfort to a grieving yet proud wife. Now, Wolf, Mr. Bush has delivered a eulogy of sorts from this altar at the National Cathedral once before. Of course, he spoke in the memorial service for the victims of the September 11th attacks, and Mr. Bush mourned 3,000 Americans lost then. He will mourn the loss of the 40th President of the United States about an hour from now.
Thanks, John. You're seeing the back of Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister of Canada, with Mikhail Gorbachev, as this motorcade begins to leave Capitol Hill to head over to the National Cathedral.
And we want to bring Christiane Amanpour into the conversation now to talk a little bit more about the heads of state we've already seen who've entered Cathedral, among them German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, the Prime Minister of Italy, Mr. Berlusconi, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and we are looking at Margaret Thatcher. People are quite surprised to see her standing as she is. Her doctors had not let her do much travel lately, but she is there and has a very long day ahead because she will be accompanying Mrs. Reagan back to California. Christiane, as we look at pictures of Gerald Ford, we actually just saw President Clinton and the former president exchanged some very warm greetings. They put hands on each other's shoulders. Talk a little bit about the reaction in Europe to the state funeral.
Well, as the family of the former President Reagan gathers and the American family gathers, so too really does the family of nations.
Our viewers are watching this, Paula, around the world on CNN International. This is a moment where so much of the world will focus in on what's happening in Washington, D.C. And this is a picture that our viewers are now seeing inside the National Cathedral. There's Margaret Thatcher with former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Mikhail Gorbachev just sitting down over there, getting ready for this next stage of this state funeral.
The former Prime Minister of Canada will also be among those who eulogize President Reagan.
It will be Lech Wałęsa, the Solidarity leader in 1981. Lech Wałęsa wrote quite an interesting piece in today's Wall Street Journal, who said, "We owe him our liberty." And he talked about the fact that the cowboy image of Ronald Reagan that the Soviets ridiculed, he said, cowboys fight for justice, fight against evil, fight for freedom. And when there were finally free elections in Poland, the Solidarity movement used the symbol of Gary Cooper in High Noon, the ultimate cowboy, and won thumpingly. And he will be in attendance at the National Cathedral, I believe, today.
Lech Wałęsa will be here, the former president of Poland, who was so instrumental in helping to end the Cold War. And there you see in the front of the screen over there, Gerald Ford, President of the United States as well. So many presidents, so many presidents have come, members of the U.S. Congress, governors, American leaders from all ranks and files.
Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld there. As we continue to watch worshipers such as Homeland Security Director Tom Ridge, let's check in with Christiane to give us a sense of what the reaction is in Europe to this national funeral. Christiane, are you there now?
Yes, Paula. As the American family and the family of Ronald Reagan are watching, so too really are the family of nations, because President Reagan had a profound impact on the world during the 8 years in which he served, some of them extremely positive and some of them regarded as not so positive. But certainly if you look just at today's title page of The Economist, it says quite simply, "The Man Who Beat Communism." And it says, Ronald Reagan was fond of a nap and no intellectual. Oddly enough, though, when it came to confronting communism, he had what it took. And although his obituaries and his champions proclaim him as the sole defeater of communism, certainly his most important relationships during his presidency in terms of international affairs were then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who is there, as you've been noting, who basically said that the Soviet leadership could not have done this on its own, although we were willing. President Reagan could not have done this on his own, although he was willing. It took our special partnership to do this. And Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan have an incredible joint work that they've done that have brought really the world to this place. And the other very special relationship that he had is with Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister for 11 years. He was the American president for 8 of her 11 years. And they were ideological soulmates, and they had a profound impact on each other's policies. And Margaret Thatcher, if you remember, was the first international leader to have met Mikhail Gorbachev, and she reported to her Western allies and fellow heads of government and state that this is a man with whom I can do business. We can do business with him. And I remember, you know, in 1985, as I'm sure everybody does, electrified watching the television screens as Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met on the steps of that formal house in Geneva for their first face-to-face meeting. And everybody wondered, what would the outcome be? Would Ronald Reagan come across as the person who had called it the evil empire, or would there be a new relationship, which indeed there was?
And if you were to read anything that Mikhail Gorbachev has written recently, he certainly reaffirmed that. There was an interesting quote that appeared in newspapers last weekend where Mikhail Gorbachev, in reflecting on Mr. Reagan's life, said, to use the terminology of those years, he was a hawk. Nevertheless, that hawk loved life. He was a man who respected traditions, and I think he was concerned about how he would be remembered in history.
Judy Woodruff is over at the National Cathedral, at least not very far away. Judy, we hear that haunting bell beginning to chime. I'm sure it's very powerful where you are as well. This is going to happen once a minute, I take it, as this service unfolds?
Yes, Wolf. As soon as the hearse carrying President Reagan's casket left the Capitol, the bell began to peal. And it's just one more element making this ceremony the closest thing we have in the United States to what one would see in a monarchy, because you have all the pomp and circumstance that one would expect in Great Britain, for example. I mean, and you look at this majestic cathedral. This is the Episcopal National Cathedral in Washington, a truly beautiful building that was decades in the building. That is going to hold over 3,000 people this morning. It all comes together, the place, the music, the ceremony. It really is as close as the United States comes to experiencing royalty. And we just saw Prince Charles sitting there in the cathedral. We are seeing all these leaders from all over the world, and ordinary people. There are the friends of the Reagan family who were there. I was listening to you all speak about Mikhail Gorbachev a minute ago, and I noticed he told a reporter just yesterday that by the end of Ronald Reagan's term in office, he was visiting Moscow, and he said to you, someone said to him, "Do you still regard the Soviet Union as an evil empire?" And by then Ronald Reagan said no. Gorbachev said very proudly that his views had changed. So many things have come full circle, not just during the time that Ronald Reagan was president, but certainly in the many years since.
Judy, this is a majestic, a simply magnificent cathedral here in the nation's capital. The official name of the Washington National Cathedral, by the way, is the Cathedral Church of St. Peter and St. Paul. Nearly 700,000 visitors and worshipers come by this cathedral every year. It's the 6th largest cathedral in the world, the 2nd largest in the United States. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is the largest church in the world. St. John's in New York City, Paula, is the largest cathedral in the United States. But it is so very majestic, so appropriate for this day.
We have shown you from time to time some of the beautiful stained glass that adorns this church. There is a particular window that you might see at some point, which actually contains a piece of lunar rock that was presented to the cathedral by astronauts of an Apollo mission. A lot of history in this place.
The cathedral center tower, here's another fact, is as tall as a 30-story building. The central tower specifically 676 feet above sea level, making its top the highest point actually in the District of Columbia. It's a truly majestic moment, and the President, Paula, has now arrived with the First Lady.
Jeff, what goes through your mind when we saw the shot where all these living presidents were panned? You saw President Ford and Betty Ford sitting next to Jimmy Carter and Rosalind, and not too far away, Bill Clinton and Hillary.
The same feeling I get when when an inaugural happens, and in the past inaugurals I've been out on the West Front, looking at this. It's an astonishing picture because you actually do see all these connections that take you back years and in some cases even decades. You look at these pictures, these cross shots, and there's Bill and Hillary Clinton, and there's Mikhail Gorbachev sitting next to Margaret Thatcher, the two from the countries that were major adversaries in the 1980s. You see presidents, not only presidents past and present, but at least a couple of people who we've glimpsed already in that crowd. I'm thinking of Rudy Giuliani, I'm thinking of Hillary Clinton, who might have designs on that job on their own. And this is just one of those very few moments when, as Judy Woodruff said, and Wolf, I think you mentioned, the partisan politics are put aside, and then there is the ceremony. And I can't help feeling that as they sit there, as all of us have been through these kinds of events, less regal, you think, okay, this is the emotion for today. This is Friday. By Monday morning, that whole other flow of emotions, of ambition and political controversy and political battle is going to be renewed again. This is a nice moment when this is put aside and it stops. all these powerful people and people on designs on more power say, okay, for now, it's a different moment.
And that may be true about your Monday prediction, but as you well know, already in some of the editorial pages in newspapers today, there's a lot of analysis of what people see as a very blurred read on the Reagan legacy.
I've already seen some conservatives angrily, well, or at least firmly saying, no, you liberals don't claim part of his legacy. Don't talk about his sunniness and optimism. This was also a man with firmly held conservative political beliefs. And don't tell us that it was a negotiated settlement with communism. Ronald Reagan said all his life that communism was an aberration and he wanted to see it wither and die, and at least with respect to the Soviet Union, he got that wish. So you're quite right, Paula. The battles are begun even as we pause for these ceremonial moments.
Seeing former Vice President Dan Quayle, former Secretary of State George Shultz.
And in the front, Colin Powell, we see the current Secretary of State. The seating here is all very carefully organized according to protocol. It's not happenstance by any means. Members of the House of Representatives, the Senate, former cabinet members, there's the Supreme Court, the justices of the Supreme Court have, of course, come, and representatives of the diplomatic corps. You see in the middle of the screen Prince Bandar wearing the keffiyeh, the Saudi ambassador to the United States, the dean of the diplomatic corps in Washington, the longest serving diplomat in Washington. The representatives of the diplomatic corps have come, representatives of the cabinet, former presidents, literally a who's who, Jeff, of important people from within, of course, the United States, but from around the world.
We saw a moment ago Chief Justice William Rehnquist. He was elevated to that post by Ronald Reagan. He'd been put on the court by Richard Nixon. And Reagan made him Chief Justice of the United States. He is, I also believe, now the longest serving member of the court.
We saw a little bit earlier Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Clarence Thomas.
That hearse, as it's driving through Washington, will eventually make its way over to Massachusetts Avenue, for those of our viewers familiar with the District of Columbia, and go up to Wisconsin Avenue, where the National Cathedral is located right now. It's going down a part of the area of the nation's capital where so many government buildings are. And one thing, interestingly, it won't be going all that far away from the Reagan building itself, which is, after the Pentagon, the second largest federal office building in Washington, D.C. right now.
There is an irony. The man who wanted to reduce the size and scope of the federal government, who was very articulate about government bureaucracy. There are more government bureaucrats working in the Ronald Reagan building, as you say, than I guess any other building but the Pentagon.
It's an amazing fact, but it's a true one.
And on this day when federal offices are closed, banks closed, many schools across the country closed, it's interesting to note that there's one sector of the business community that will not be at work today. The Telemarketing Association has encouraged its callers not to make phone calls to American residents today.
Not necessarily
nice of them, huh?
An appropriate thing to do on this National Day of Mourning in the United States. Prince Charles and Brian Mulroney, the former Prime Minister of Canada. You know, Paul, I spoke with him yesterday. He's going to be delivering one of those eulogies, and he had met with Nancy Reagan, and he emerged from Blair House to say how strong he felt she was. Even though she may look frail on television, he was really impressed that she was doing all right under these circumstances.
Mr. Mulroney has also been quoted as saying of Ronald Reagan, quote, he was probably one of the few leaders that I've met around the world who was entirely free from malice. He actually never had a bad word to say about anybody.
Judy Woodruff, I assume that whole area around the National Cathedral has basically been shut down. Given the number of world leaders, the security precautions, the streets that have been closed, it must be rather intense. You and I have been in Washington a long time. Have you ever seen anything like this around that part of the city?
Wolf, if you're talking to me, didn't hear you call my name, but yes, absolutely. We've never seen anything like it. Somebody said we may see as many as 50 secure motorcades approaching the cathedral. That's why they have blocked off I don't know how many square blocks around here. And there are people who were standing out on the street as early as 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock this morning, wanting to catch a glimpse of this motorcade. It's not just Californians, and it's not just those who wanted to come to the Capitol from the surrounding states. People who live in the District of Columbia are genuinely moved by Ronald Reagan and by what he meant, and they're out here too. The weather is turning worse by the minute, I have to say. When we got up here about an hour ago, it was just beginning to mist, and now it's coming down, and it's wetter than it was, let me put it that way. And somehow it, you know, fits the mood, I suppose you could say, because
I want to point out, Judy, this motorcade is now passing the World War II memorial here on the National Mall. This is the memorial that was just opened up Memorial Day weekend to commemorate the veterans, those who struggled and saved the world, literally. Paula, during World War II, you were there when it was dedicated.
Which was an incredible ceremony just over the Memorial Day weekend. I'm reminded of what Ronald Reagan did during World War II, which was actually make training films for the U.S. government.
And yet there is a connection, because Ronald Reagan died on the eve of the 60th anniversary of D-Day. One of Ronald Reagan's great speeches on the 40th anniversary, the famous "These are the boys of Pontefract, these are the men who took the cliffs." And you see, particularly among Reagan's stronger admirers on policy, a kind of link. They're saying the resoluteness of World War II was what Reagan brought to the Cold War, and they will argue that's what President George W. Bush is bringing to the war on terror. Now, obviously, there are political adversaries who don't accept that, but the timing of Reagan's passing, so close to the D-Day anniversary, I think kind of, and a week after the World War II dedication, melds those two things in a lot of our minds, even though Ronald Reagan was indeed a maker of training films in World War II, and his war was the Cold War.
President Bush and Barbara Bush walking in to this majestic National Cathedral. Let's just listen a little bit to this wonderful music. Interestingly, I was going to say, Paula, if we see the way they're seated, the former presidents, what a scene that is. I don't exactly know why Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are in one row ahead of the other former presidents, but maybe Jeff or Paula, maybe you know.
Loaded in the order of what they were elected?
I'm guessing it's the election. He's the most recent ex-president.
He's the most diplomatic way of doing it.
I know this is a town that always likes more complicated explanations, but I think that's probably it.
It's interesting to see here John King report earlier.
Maybe John King, our reporter at the White House, knows, John.
That is, in fact, the case, and it is protocol, and it is also according to the plan drafted by former President Reagan and, of course, fine-tuned by Nancy Reagan over the past 10 years. The presidents will be sitting in the order of their service.
Let's listen to Ronan Tynan, who will sing several points this morning.
Gratia plena,
What we're seeing now, the motorcade has now arrived at the National Cathedral here in Washington. The motorcade bringing the casket of Ronald Reagan, as well as the cars, the separate limousines, bringing Nancy Reagan and her family to this National Cathedral, the President of the United States, the First Lady now being escorted to their seats inside as well.
We just saw the First Lady put a hand on the shoulder of Prime Minister Tony Blair. Let's bring Judy Woodruff now back into the conversation, who is right outside the cathedral. Judy?
Paula, we are watching the same pictures you are, and we're watching the motorcade with Mrs. Reagan come out. We want to keep a close look at Mrs. Reagan. Of course, we're all watching her, but on Wednesday, I'm told that on the suit she was wearing 2 small miniatures. I noticed that she had 2 pins that were very close together, but I was never able to get a close enough look. I've been told since then that each of those pins was a miniature of her husband, one of Ronald Reagan as a baby and the other of him as president. This was on Wednesday, the day that she flew with the casket across the country to Washington. She wore that throughout the ceremonies there at the Capitol, and she may very well be wearing that again today. We're all going to be looking. I just have to join in with all of you and just say what a remarkable, rare thing it is to see all of these former presidents, every living, the one living and every former living president together. We don't see that except in moments of great tragedy. Too often it is a moment of great tragedy and mourning such as this one.
The empty seats on the left are the seats that are being saved for Mrs. Reagan, for the family, for the other distinguished guests who are being escorted now in this motorcade to the National Cathedral. Once they are inside, of course, this formal service, Paula, will begin. And there's John Danforth in the middle of the screen, the former United States Senator, the man designated to be the next U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, standing on the stairs outside of the National Cathedral. He's an Episcopal priest, and he will lead this service.
He once came up against Ronald Reagan over a very explosive political issue, and he said of the president that he never said anything mean or nasty or angry about it at all. It's what you really, really wanted to support him for, after all.
And if you're looking for yet more connections, John Danforth was the mentor of Clarence Thomas, who was appointed to the Supreme Court by the first President Bush, whose presidency probably not would have happened but for the fact that Ronald Reagan, at a dramatic moment in 1980, after consulting with former President Ford on whether he might join Reagan's ticket as vice president, deciding that wouldn't work, picked George Bush, the man who he'd run against in the primaries. Bush ascended to the presidency 8 years later, largely on Reagan's, or substantially on Reagan's record, and that's why John Danforth's protege Clarence Thomas is on the Supreme Court. I mean, the connections inside this cathedral, you could probably spend the rest of the day drawing them out.
There will be other representatives of other religious groups here at this event as well, including the Catholic Archbishop of Washington, His Eminence Theodore Cardinal McCarrick will be here. His Eminence the Archbishop, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop Demetrius will be here as well as the Imam Mohammed Majid Ali, the Imam and Director of the Al Dulles Area Muslim Society, who will come. And as we look at the honorary pallbearers who are already here at the National Cathedral, including Merv Griffin and Charles Wick in the middle of your screen, let's also note that Rabbi Harold Kushner will actually be reading from the Old Testament at this service once it begins. So all religious faiths will be participating in effect in honoring the 40th President of the United States.
John King, I know you were reflecting on the same pictures we were looking at from here when we saw all the living presidents in the first 2 rows here in the cathedral. And there's been a lot of talk about how the former President Bush is going to separate his eulogy from his son. Do you have any more thoughts on what we might hear later today?
Many comparisons, Paula, made this week between the current President Bush and President Reagan. Both Western governors, both came to town pushing tax cuts, both thought of themselves as plain-spoken men. One big difference, when they played Hail to the Chief outside the Capitol this morning, when this President Bush took office, he told aides not to play it. He found it too pretentious. He often seems to be speed-walking from meeting to meeting. He has a very quick pace about him. Ronald Reagan walked with this slow, lazy gait, always looking over his shoulder. Someone who I think much more than the current president wanted to savor every last second of the pageantry of the presidency.
There was some second guessing earlier this week when the president did not make it back on Tuesday into the Capitol Rotunda because he was at the G8 summit, and yet you were covering this yesterday. He made a personal visit to Nancy Reagan at the Blair House and also visited the Rotunda. Tell us a little bit more about what relationship existed between George W. Bush and President Reagan.
They met each other, of course, many times when this president's father was the vice president. No one here says there was any close personal relationship between the current president and former President Reagan. They do say that this president has developed a very friendly, cordial relationship with Nancy Reagan. Much has been made of their difference on the issue of stem cell research, but aides say this president checks in with her from time to time, has done so throughout his presidency, and that they have quite a nice personal rapport. And they did spend 40 minutes, Laura Bush and George Bush, with Nancy Reagan last night. And you mentioned the G8 summit. Aides say Mr. Bush left that up to Nancy Reagan. It was obviously a very important moment for this president on the international stage, and that Nancy Reagan said, if you think you need to be there, please stay put.
Thank you, John. Dreary day out there.
It is dreary, and so many have already pointed out, and I'm sure many more will continue to point out, perhaps appropriate, on this National Day of Mourning here in the United States, that it's overcast, that it's drizzling, and it may actually start raining a little bit harder in the coming hours.
John mentioned the close relationship between Nancy Reagan and President Bush. There is, in a political sense, an interesting and I think growing debate within the American right of whether George W. Bush's policies with Iraq are a continuation of what Ronald Reagan would have done and a repudiation. It has split the so-called neoconservatives, people like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, that view, from more traditional conservatives who have a more skeptical view of international engagements in general. And this fight is going on in conservative publications, even as we are speaking. It's raging in the pages of the American Spectator, and different sides among conservatives are taking sides on whether George W. Bush is carrying on Reagan's philosophy or breaking with it.
The 4.5-mile journey from Capitol Hill to the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. has now come to an end as this hearse carrying the casket of Ronald Reagan arrives in the front of the National Cathedral. It will be removed from the casket, carried inside as this memorial service will get underway. The chimes, the bells will continue to ring once a minute for the time being, and then afterwards there will be a much, much louder and sustained chiming of those bells.
Let's just watch and listen.
Color, forward, march.
With faith in Jesus Christ, we receive the body of our brother Ronald for burial. Let us pray with confidence to God, the giver of life, that he will raise him to perfection in the company of the saints. Deliver your servant Ronald, O sovereign Lord Christ, from all evil, and set him free from every bond, that he may rest with all your saints in the eternal habitations, where with the Father and the Holy Spirit you live and reign, one God forever and ever.
Amen.
Let us also pray for all who mourn, that they may cast their care on God and know the consolation of his love. Almighty God, look with pity upon the sorrows of your servants for whom we pray. Remember them, Lord, in your mercy. Nourish them with patience. Comfort them with a sense of your goodness. Lift up your countenance upon them and give them peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though this body be destroyed, yet shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not as a stranger. For none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself. For if we live unto the Lord, and if we die unto the Lord. Whether we live, therefore, or die, we are the Lord's. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, even so saith the Spirit, for they rest from their labors.
There's hope, center, base. Over, march.
Let us pray. O God, whose mercies cannot be numbered, accept our prayers on behalf of thy servant Ronald, and grant him an entrance into the land of light and joy. In the fellowship of thy saints, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.
Where does a person find the strength to persevere in difficult times? Many people find that strength in the pages of the Bible. Turning to the book of Isaiah, the 40th chapter. V'kovei Adonai yachalifu choach, ya'alu ez ever kanasharim, yarutzu v'lo yiga'u, yelchu v'lo yi'afu. Hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Lord, creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. He gives power to the faint, and to them that have no might, he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fail. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not feel faint. Here ends the reading.
This is a reading from a sermon delivered in 1630 by the Pilgrim leader John Winthrop, who was aboard the ship the Arabella on his way from England to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The city on the hill passage was referenced by President Reagan in several notable speeches. Now, the only way to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world.
Reagan's deepest long-held wish was that Lady Thatcher should participate in this service. But as the years have passed, Lady Thatcher's health, too, has suffered its ups and downs. 18 months ago, her doctors advised her to give up all formal public speaking. But she was determined to record her tribute to President Reagan, come what may, and this she has done. She was equally determined on learning of the President's death to be with us today. The next voice you will hear will be Lady Thatcher's.
We have lost a great president, a great American, and a great man, and I have lost a dear friend. In his lifetime, Ronald Reagan was such a cheerful and invigorating presence that it was easy to forget what daunting historic tasks he set himself. He sought to mend America's wounded spirit, to restore the strength of the free world, and to free the slaves of communism. These were causes hard to accomplish and heavy with risk, yet they were pursued with almost a lightness of spirit, for Ronald Reagan also embodied another great cause, what Arnold Bennett once called the great cause of cheering us all up. His politics had a freshness and optimism that won converts from every class and every nation, and ultimately from the very heart of the evil empire. Yet his humor often had a purpose beyond humor. In the terrible hours after the attempt on his life, his easy jokes gave reassurance to an anxious world. They were evidence that in the aftermath of terror and in the midst of hysteria, one great heart at least remained sane and jocular. They were truly grace under pressure. And perhaps they signified grace of a deeper kind. Ronnie himself certainly believed that he had been given back his life for a purpose. As he told a priest after his recovery, "Whatever time I've got left now belongs to the big fella upstairs." And surely, it is hard to deny that Ronald Reagan's life was providential when we look at what he achieved in the 8 years that followed. Others prophesied the decline of the West. He inspired America and its allies with renewed faith in their mission of freedom. Others saw only limits to growth. He transformed a stagnant economy into an engine of opportunity. Others hoped at best for an uneasy cohabitation with the Soviet Union. He won the Cold War, not only without firing a shot, but also by inviting enemies out of their fortress and turning them into friends. I cannot imagine how any diplomat or any dramatist could improve on his words to Mikhail Gorbachev at the Geneva summit. Let me tell you why it is we distrust you. Those words are candid and tough, and they cannot have been easy to hear. But they're also a clear invitation to a new beginning and a new relationship that would be rooted in trust. We live today in the world that Ronald Reagan began to reshape with those words. It is a very different world with different challenges and new dangers. All in all, however, it is one of greater freedom and prosperity, one more hopeful than the world he inherited on becoming president. As Prime Minister, I worked closely with Ronald Reagan for 8 of the most important years of all our lives. We talked regularly, both before and after his presidency, and I've had time and cause to reflect on what made him a great president. Ronald Reagan knew his own mind. He had firm principles, and I believe right ones. He expounded them clearly. He acted upon them decisively. When the world threw problems at the White House, He was not baffled or disorientated or overwhelmed. He knew almost instinctively what to do. When his aides were preparing option papers for his decision, they were able to cut out entire rafts of proposals that they knew the old man would never wear. When his allies came under Soviet or domestic pressure, they could look confidently to Washington for firm leadership. And when his enemies tested American resolve, they soon discovered that his resolve was firm and unyielding. Yet his ideas, though clear, were never simplistic. He saw the many sides of truth. Yes, he warned that the Soviet Union had an insatiable drive for military power and territorial expansion. But he also sensed it was being eaten away by systemic failures impossible to reform. Yes, he did not shrink from denouncing Moscow's evil empire, but he realized that a man of goodwill might nonetheless emerge from within its dark corridors. So the president resisted Soviet expansion and pressed down on Soviet weakness at every point until the day came when communism began to collapse beneath the combined weight of those pressures and its own failures. And when a man of goodwill did emerge from the ruins, President Reagan stepped forward to shake his hand and to offer sincere cooperation. Nothing was more typical of Ronald Reagan than that large-hearted magnanimity, and nothing was more American. Therein lies perhaps the final explanation of his achievements. Ronald Reagan carried the American people with him in his great endeavors because there was perfect sympathy between them. He and they loved America and what it stands for: freedom and opportunity for ordinary people. As an actor in Hollywood's golden age, he helped to make the American dream live for millions all over the globe. His own life was a fulfillment of that dream. He never succumbed to the embarrassment some people feel about an honest expression of love of country. He was able to say, "God bless America," with equal fervor in public and in private. And so he was able to call confidently upon his fellow countrymen to make sacrifices for America, and to make sacrifices for those who look to America for hope and rescue. With the lever of American patriotism, he lifted up the world. And so today, the world, in Prague, in Budapest, in Warsaw, in Sofia, in Bucharest, in Kiev, and in Moscow itself, the world mourns the passing of the great liberator and echoes his prayer, "God bless America." Ronald Reagan's life was rich, not only in public achievement, but also in private happiness. Indeed, his public achievements were rooted in his private happiness. The great turning point of his life was his meeting and marriage with Nancy. On that we have the plain testimony of a loving and grateful husband. Nancy came along and saved my soul. We share her grief today, but we also share her pride and the grief and pride of Ronnie's children. For the final years of his life, Ronnie's mind was clouded by illness. That cloud has now lifted. He is himself again, more himself than at any time on this earth. For we may be sure that the big fella upstairs never forgets those who remember him. And as the last journey of this faithful pilgrim took him beyond the sunset, and as heaven's morning broke, I like to think, in the words of Bunyan, that all the trumpets sounded on the other side. We here still move in twilight, But we have one beacon to guide us that Ronald Reagan never had. We have his example. Let us give thanks today for a life that achieved so much for all of God's children.
In the spring of 1987, President Reagan and I were driven into a large hangar at the Ottawa airport to await the arrival of Mrs. Reagan and my wife Mila prior to departure ceremonies for their return to Washington. We were alone except for the security details. President Reagan's visit had been important, demanding, and successful. Our discussions reflected the international agenda of the times, the nuclear threat posed by the Soviet Union and the missile deployment by NATO, pressures in the Warsaw Pact, challenges resulting from the Berlin Wall and the ongoing separation of Germany, and bilateral and hemispheric free trade. President Reagan had spoken to Parliament, handled complex files with skill and good humor, strongly impressing his Canadian hosts. And here we were, waiting for our wives. When their car drove in a moment later, out stepped Nancy and Mila, looking like $1 million. And as they headed towards us, President Reagan beamed. He threw his arm around my shoulder, and he said with a grin, "You know, Brian, for two Irishmen, we sure married up." In that visit, in that moment, one saw the quintessential Ronald Reagan, the leader we respected, the neighbor we admired, and the friend we loved. A president of the United States of America, whose truly remarkable life we celebrate in this magnificent cathedral today. Presidents and prime ministers everywhere, I suspect, sometimes wonder how history will deal with them. Some even evince a touch of the insecurity of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, an Irish immigrant to Canada who became a father of our Confederation. In one of his poems, McGee, thinking of his birthplace, wrote poignantly, "Am I remembered in Erin? I charge you, speak me true. Has my name a sound, a meaning, in the scenes my boyhood knew?" Ronald Reagan will not have to worry about Erin, because they remember him well and affectionately there. Indeed they do. From Erin to Estonia, from Maryland to Madagascar, from Montreal to Monterey. Ronald Reagan does not enter history tentatively. He does so with certainty and panache. At home and on the world stage, his were not the pallid etchings of a timorous politician. They were the bold strokes of a confident and accomplished leader. Some in the West, during the early 1980s, believed communism and democracy were equally valid and viable. This was the school of moral equivalence. In contrast, Ronald Reagan saw Soviet communism as a menace to be confronted, in the genuine belief that its squalid underpinnings would fall swiftly to the gathering winds of freedom, provided, as he said, that NATO and the industrialized democracies stood firm and united. They did, and we know now who was right. Ronald Reagan was a president who inspired his nation and transformed the world. He possessed a rare and prized gift called leadership, that ineffable and magical quality that sets some men and women apart so that millions will follow them as they conjure up grand visions and invite their countrymen to dream big and exciting dreams. I always thought that President Reagan's understanding of the nobility of the presidency coincided with that American dream. One day, in Brussels, President Mitterrand, in referring to President Reagan, said, "Il a vraiment la notion de l'État." Rough translation, he really has a sense of the state about him. The translation does not fully capture the profundity of the observation. What President Mitterrand meant is that there is a vast difference between the job of president and the role of president. Ronald Reagan fulfilled both with elegance and ease, embodying himself that unusual alchemy of history and tradition and achievement and inspirational conduct and national pride that define the special role the President of the United States of America must assume at all times, at home and around the world. La notion de l'État. No one understood it better than Ronald Reagan, and no one could more eloquently summon his nation to high purpose or bring forth the majesty of the presidency and make it glow better than the man who referred to his own nation as a city on the hill. May our common future and that of our great nations be guided by wise men and women who will remember always the golden achievements of the Reagan era and the success that can be theirs if the values of freedom and democracy are preserved unsullied and undiminished until the unfolding decades can remember little else. I have been truly blessed to have been a friend of Ronald Reagan. I am grateful that our paths crossed and that our lives touched. I shall always remember him with the deepest admiration and affection, and I will always feel honored by the journey that we traveled together in search of better and more peaceful tomorrows for all God's children everywhere. And so, in the presence of his beloved and indispensable Nancy, his children, his family, and his friends, and all of the American people that he so deeply revered, I say au revoir today to a gifted leader, an historic president, and a gracious human being. And I do so with a line from Yeats, who wrote, "Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say, my glory was that I had such friends."
The New York Times wrote, "Men will thank God 100 years from now that Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the White House. It will not take 100 years to thank God for Ronald Reagan. But why? Why was he so admired? Why was he so beloved? He was beloved first because of what he was. Politics can be cruel, uncivil. Our friend was strong and gentle. Once he called America hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That was America, and yes, our friend. And next, Ronald Reagan was beloved because what he believed. He believed in America, so he made it his shining city on the hill. He believed in freedom, so he acted on behalf of its values and ideals. He believed in tomorrow, so the great communicator became the great liberator. He talked of winning one for the Gipper, and as president, through his relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev with us today, the Gipper, and yes, Mikhail Gorbachev, won one for peace around the world. If Ronald Reagan created a better world for many millions, it was because of the world someone else created for him. Nancy was there for him always. Her love for him provided much of his strength, and their love together transformed all of us, as we've seen renewed seeing again here in the last few days. And one of the many memories we all have of both of them is the comfort they provided during our national tragedies. Whether it was the families of the crew of the Challenger shuttle, or the USS Stark, or the Marines killed in Beirut, we will never forget those images of the President and First Lady embracing them and embracing us during times of sorrow. So Nancy, I want to say this to you. Today, America embraces you. We open up our arms. We seek to comfort you, to tell you of our admiration for your courage and your selfless caring. And to the Reagan kids, it's okay for me to say that at 80, Michael, Ron, Patty, today all of our sympathy, all of our condolences to you all. And we remember too your sister Maureen, home safe now with her father. As his vice president for 8 years, I learned more from Ronald Reagan than from anyone I encountered in all my years of public life. I learned kindness. We all did. I also learned courage. The nation did. Who can forget the horrible day in March 1981? He looked at the doctors in the emergency room and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." And then I learned decency. The whole world did. Days after being shot, weak from wounds, he spilled water from a sink. And entering the hospital room, aides saw him on his hands and knees, wiping water from the floor. He worried that his nurse would get in trouble. The good book says humility goes before honor, and our friend had both. And who could not cherish such a man? And perhaps as important as anything, I learned a lot about humor, a lot about laughter. And oh, how President Reagan loved a good story. When asked, "How did your visit go with Bishop Tutu?" he replied, "So-so." And it was typical. It was wonderful. And in leaving the White House, the very last day, he left in the yard outside the Oval Office door a little sign for the squirrels. He loved to feed those squirrels. He left this sign that said, "Beware the dog." And to no avail, because our dog Millie came in and beat the heck out of the squirrels. But anyway, he also left me a note at the top of which said, "Don't let the turkeys get you down." Well, he certainly never let him get him down, and he fought hard for his beliefs, but he led conviction, but never made an adversary into an enemy. He was never mean-spirited. Reverend Billy Graham, who I refer to as the nation's pastor, is now hospitalized and regrets that he can't be here today. And I asked him for a Bible passage that might be appropriate. And he suggested this from Psalm 37. "The Lord delights in the way of the man whose steps he has made firm. Though he stumble, he will not fall. For the Lord upholds him with his hand." And then this too from 37, "There is a future for the man of peace." God bless you, Ronald Wilson Reagan, and the nation you loved and led so well.
Mrs. Reagan, Patty, Michael, and Ron, members of the Reagan family, distinguished guests, including our presidents and first ladies, Reverend Danforth, fellow citizens. We lost Ronald Reagan only days ago, but we have missed him for a long time. We have missed his kindly presence, that reassuring voice, and the happy ending we had wished for him. It has been 10 years since he said his own farewell. Yet it is still very sad and hard to let him go. Ronald Reagan belongs to the ages now, but we preferred it when he belonged to us. In a life of good fortune, he valued above all the gracious gift of his wife, Nancy. During his career, Ronald Reagan passed through 1,000 crowded places. But there was only one person, he said, who could make him lonely by just leaving the room. America honors you, Nancy, for the loyalty and love you gave this man on a wonderful journey, and to that journey's end. Today, our whole nation grieves with you and your family. When the sun sets tonight off the coast of California, and we lay to rest our 40th president, a great American story will close. The second son of Nell and Jack Reagan first knew the world as a place of open plains, quiet streets, gas-lit rooms, and carriages drawn by horse. If you could go back to the Dixon, Illinois of 1922, you'd find a boy of 11 reading adventure stories at the public library, or running with his brother Neil along Rock River, and coming home to a little house on Hennepin Avenue. That town was the kind of place he remembered where you prayed side by side with your neighbors. And if things were going wrong for them, you prayed for them and knew they'd pray for you if things went wrong for you. The Reagan family would see its share of hardship, struggle, and uncertainty. And out of that circumstance came a young man of steadiness, calm, and a cheerful confidence that life would bring good things. The qualities all of us have seen in Ronald Reagan were first spotted 70 and 80 years ago. As the lifeguard in Lowell Park, he was the protector, keeping an eye out for trouble. As a sports announcer on the radio, he was the friendly voice that made you see the game as he did. As an actor, he was the handsome all-American good guy, which in his case required knowing his lines and being himself. Along the way, certain convictions were formed and fixed in the man. Ronald Reagan believed that everything happens for a reason, and that we should strive to know and do the will of God. He believed that the gentleman always does the kindest thing. He believed that people were basically good and had the right to be free. He believed that bigotry and prejudice were the worst things a person could be guilty of. He believed in the golden rule and in the power of prayer. He believed that America was not just a place in the world, but the hope of the world. And he believed in taking a break now and then, because, as he said, there's nothing better for the inside of a man than the outside of a horse. Ronald Reagan spent decades in the film industry and in politics, fields known on occasion to change a man, but not this man. From Dixon to Des Moines, to Hollywood, to Sacramento, to Washington, D.C., all who met him remembered the same sincere, honest, upright fellow. Ronald Reagan's deepest beliefs never had much to do with fashion or convenience. His convictions were always politely stated, affably argued, and as firm and straight as the columns of this cathedral. There came a point in Ronald Reagan's film career when people started seeing a future beyond the movies. The actor Robert Cummings recalled one occasion. I was sitting around the set with all these people and we were listening to Ronnie, quite absorbed. I said, "Ron, have you ever considered someday becoming president?" He said, "President of what?" "President of the United States," I said. And he said, "What's the matter? Don't you like my acting either?" The clarity and intensity of Ronald Reagan's convictions led to speaking engagements around the country and a new following he did not seek or expect. He often began his speeches by saying, "I'm going to talk about controversial things." And then he spoke of communist rulers as slave masters, of a government in Washington that had far overstepped its proper limits, of a time for choosing that was drawing near. In the space of a few years, he took ideas and principles that were mainly found in journals and books and turned them into a broad, hopeful movement ready to govern. As soon as Ronald Reagan became California's governor, observers saw a star in the west, tanned, well-tailored, in command, and on his way. In the 1960s, his friend Bill Buckley wrote, "Reagan is indisputably a part of America, and he may become a part of American history." Ronald Reagan's movement arrived in 1980. He came out ahead of some very good men, including one from Plains and one from Houston. What followed was one of the decisive decades of the century, as the convictions that shaped the president began to shape the times. He came to office with great hopes for America, and more than hopes. Like the president he had revered and once saw in person, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan matched an optimistic temperament with bold, persistent action. President Reagan was optimistic about the great promise of economic reform, and he acted to restore the rewards and spirit of enterprise. He was optimistic that a strong America could advance the peace, and he acted to build the strength that mission required. He was optimistic that liberty would thrive wherever it was planted. And he acted to defend liberty wherever it was threatened. And Ronald Reagan believed in the power of truth in the conduct of world affairs. When he saw evil camped across the horizon, he called that evil by its name. There were no doubters in the prisons and gulags where dissidents spread the news, tapping to each other in code what the American president had dared to say. There were no doubters in the shipyards and churches and secret labor meetings where brave men and women began to hear the creaking and rumbling of a collapsing empire. And there were no doubters among those who swung hammers at the hated wall that the first and hardest blow had been struck by President Ronald Reagan. The ideology he opposed throughout his political life insisted that history was moved by impersonal tides and unalterable fates. Ronald Reagan believed instead in the courage and triumph of free men. And we believe it all the more because we saw that courage in him. As he showed what a president should be, he also showed us what a man should be. Ronald Reagan carried himself, even in the most powerful office, with a decency and attention to small kindnesses that also define a good life. He was a courtly, gentle, and considerate man, never known to slight or embarrass others. Many people across the country cherish letters he wrote in his own hand to family members on important occasions, to old friends dealing with sickness and loss, to strangers with questions about his days in Hollywood. Boy once wrote to him requesting federal assistance to help clean up his bedroom. The president replied that unfortunately funds are dangerously low. He continued, "I'm sure your mother was fully justified in proclaiming your room a disaster. Therefore, you are in an excellent position to launch another volunteer program in our nation. Congratulations." See, our 40th president wore his title lightly, and it fit like a white Stetson. In the end, through his belief in our country and his love for our country, he became an enduring symbol of our country. We think of the steady stride, that tilt of the head and snap of the salute, the big screen smile, and the glint in his Irish eyes when a story came to mind. We think of a man advancing in years with the sweetness and sincerity of a scout saying the pledge. We think of that grave expression that sometimes came over his face, the seriousness of a man angered by injustice and frightened by nothing. We know, as he always said, that America's best days are ahead of us. But with Ronald Reagan's passing, some very fine days are behind us, and that is worth our tears. Americans saw death approach Ronald Reagan twice, in a moment of violence, and then in the years of departing light. He met both with courage and grace. In these trials, he showed how a man so enchanted by life can be at peace with life's end. And where does that strength come from? Where is that courage learned? It is the faith of a boy who read the Bible with his mom. It is the faith of a man lying in an operating room who prayed for the one who shot him before he prayed for himself. It is the faith of a man with a fearful illness who waited on the Lord to call him home. Now, death has done all that death can do. And as Ronald Wilson Reagan goes his way, we are left with the joyful hope he shared. In his last years, he saw through a glass darkly. Now he sees his Savior face to face. And we look for that fine day when we will see him again. All weariness gone, clear of mind, strong and sure and smiling again. And the sorrow of this parting gone forever. May God bless Ronald Reagan and the country he loved.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." The Gospel of the Lord.
May I speak in the name of one God who created us, who redeemed us, who comforts us. Amen. This is a service about Ronald Reagan, and it is a religious service. We've gathered to celebrate the life of a great president in a church where believers profess their faith. So this is not only about a person, but about faith. And the homily is the place to connect the two. For President Reagan, the text is obvious. It's from the Sermon on the Mount. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. It was his favorite theme from his first inaugural address to his final address from the Oval Office. For him, America was the shining city on a hill. His immediate source was a sermon preached by John Winthrop, just read by Justice O'Connor. Winthrop believed that the eyes of the world would be on America because God had given us a special commission. So it was our duty to shine forth. The Winthrop message became the Reagan message. It rang of optimism, and we longed to hear it, especially after the dark years of Vietnam and Watergate. It was a vision with policy implications. America could not hide its light under a bushel. It could not turn in on itself and hunker down. Isolationism was not an option. Neither was protectionism. We must champion freedom everywhere. We must be the beacon for the world. What Ronald Reagan asked of America, he gave of himself. The great American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote, "The children of light and the children of darkness." If ever we have known a child of light, it was Ronald Reagan. He was aglow with it. He had no dark side, no scary hidden agenda. What you saw was what you got, and what you saw was that sure sign of inner light, the twinkle in the eye. He was not consumed by himself. He didn't need to be president to be a complete person. The only thing he really needed was to be with his wife. Mrs. Reagan, you shared him with us, and for that, we will always be grateful. He shined the light, but not upon himself. Personally modest, he disclaimed the title, the Great Communicator, and claimed only to communicate great things from the heart of a great nation. He liked to laugh, especially at himself. There was nothing petty or mean-spirited about him. Even his opponents liked him. I recall sitting at a table with President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill listening to their jokes. It was the opposite of negative politics. He inspired devotion more than fear. Mike Deaver wrote, "There was something about him that made you want to please him and do your best." This applied to everybody. It certainly applied to those of us who served in Congress. His most challenging test came on the day he was shot. He wrote in his diary of struggling for breath and of praying. I realized I couldn't ask for God's help, while at the same time I felt hatred for the mixed-up young man who shot me, he wrote. Isn't that the meaning of the lost sheep? We are all God's children and therefore equally loved by him. So I began to pray for his soul and that he would find his way back to the fold. He was a child of light. Now consider the faith we profess in this church. Light shining in darkness is an ancient biblical theme. Genesis tells us that in the beginning darkness was upon the face of the deep. Some equate this darkness with chaos. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Creating light in darkness is God's work. You and I know the meaning of darkness. We see it on the evening news. Terror, chaos, war. An enduring image of 9/11 is that on a brilliantly clear day, a cloud of darkness covered lower Manhattan. Darkness is real, and it can be terrifying. Sometimes it seems to be everywhere. So the question for us is, what do we do when darkness surrounds us? St. Paul answered that question. He said, we must walk as children of light. President Reagan taught us that this is our mission, both as individuals and as a nation. The faith proclaimed in this church is that when we walk as children of light, darkness cannot prevail. As St. John's Gospel tells us, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. That's true even of death. For people of faith, death is no less awful than for anyone else. But the resurrection means that death is not the end. The Bible describes the most terrible moment in these words. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. That was the darkness of Good Friday. It did not prevail. Very early on the first day of the week when the sun had risen, that's the beginning of the Easter story. The light shines. The Lord is risen. In this service of worship, we celebrate the life of a great president, and we profess the resurrection faith of this church. It is faith in God's victory over darkness. It is faith in the ultimate triumph of light. We believe in this victory every day of our lives. We believe it as individuals. We believe it as a nation. There is no better time to celebrate the triumph of light than in a service for Ronald Reagan. Amen.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Was grace that forth my heart to feel, and grace my fear relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. Many dangers, toils, and sins I have already gone. 'Tis grace that brought me safe this far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been left 10,000 tears, bright shining as the sun, with marvelous grace to sing God's praise. Then when we
Let us stand and say together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever.
In peace, let us pray to the Lord. Almighty God, who hast knit together thine elect in one communion and fellowship in the mystical body of thy Son, Christ our Lord, grant, we beseech thee, to thy whole church in paradise and on earth, thy light and thy peace.
Amen.
Grant that all who have been baptized into Christ's death and resurrection may die to sin and rise to newness of life, and that through the grave and gate of death we may pass with him to our joyful resurrection. Grant to us who are still in our pilgrimage and who walk as yet by faith, that thy Holy Spirit may lead us in holiness and righteousness all our days. Grant to thy faithful people pardon and peace, that we may be cleansed from all our sins and serve thee with a quiet mind. Grant to all who mourn a sure confidence in thy fatherly care, that casting all their grief on thee, they may know the consolation of thy love. Grant us, with all who have died in the hope of the resurrection, to have our consummation and bliss in thy eternal and everlasting glory. And with blessed Peter and Paul and all thy saints, to receive the crown of life which thou dost promise to all who share in the victory of thy Son, Jesus Christ, who liveth and reigneth with thee and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Give rest, O Christ, to thy servant with thy saints.
Where sorrow and pain are no more, thy
Thou only art immortal, the creator and maker of mankind, and we are mortal, formed of the earth, and unto earth shall we return. For so thou didst ordain when thou createdst me, saying, dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. All we go down to the dust, yet even at the grave we make our song, Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. Into thy hands, O merciful Savior, we commend thy servant Ronald. Acknowledge, we humbly beseech thee, a sheep of thine own fold, a lamb of thine own flock, a sinner of thine own redeeming. Receive him into the arms of thy mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the glorious company of the saints in light.
Amen. The God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ, the great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the everlasting covenant, make you perfect in every good work to do his will, working in you that which is well-pleasing in his sight. And on this day, may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you and remain with you forever. Amen.
Let us go forth in the name of Christ.
Thanks be to God.
service, touching eulogies, spectacular music, Wolf.
That hearse now carrying the casket of President Ronald Reagan to the next stop. The next stop, of course, being Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Maryland, right outside Washington, D.C., where the flight will eventually take him and the family to the Presidential Library in California for the burial, Jeff, at sunset tonight.
I think we heard all the right grace notes. We heard a touch of humor from former President George Herbert Walker Bush and former Canadian Prime Minister Mulroney. We heard a reference to Reagan's stirring words. The reading from Sandra Day O'Connor, Ronald Reagan put her on the court as the first woman justice. The reference from the sermon by John Winthrop aboard the Arabella of the shining city on the hill. And for me, at least most movingly, were the really eloquent words of Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, who insisted on doing this despite her frail health. It was done on tape, illustrated with images from Reagan's most memorable moments, when she talked of him as the great liberator. She talked about his lightness of spirit, and I thought of all the grace notes, seeing this old war comrade, Cold War comrade of Ronald Reagan's, ailing though she was, come on like a champion. That to me was a particularly moving moment.
It took a lot of courage on her part too. There were some other phrases she used that I think were touching, and I guess we should say all of the eulogies spoke to Ronald Reagan's optimism and his belief in America, but she said at one point that the president sought to mend America's overworked spirit. And then she said what he succeeded in was the great cause of cheering us up.
I was particularly struck by the first President Bush when he was speaking. He had been the vice president for 8 years under Ronald Reagan, and as he himself had predicted only in the past few days, he thought he wouldn't necessarily be able to deliver this eulogy without getting choked up to some degree, and he clearly did. It was difficult at that one moment when he had to pause and collect his thoughts somewhat. Judy Woodruff, you were watching all of this together with us, indeed together with the entire world. What were you thinking?
Wolf, you know, I was just about to make exactly the same point about the first President Bush. We call him Bush 41. He was, you know, we haven't seen a lot of emotion this week. We've had time to prepare, to think about the death of Ronald Reagan. And so when George H.W. Bush, President Bush, the first President Bush, clearly choked up, and it was when he said, "I learned more from Ronald Reagan than from anyone else in public life." And you have to remember, this was someone who was chosen to be Ronald Reagan's vice president across a political divide. They had not been necessarily allies. George Bush and Ronald Reagan were running against one another for president in 1980, and yet Ronald Reagan asked him to be his running mate. They weren't even good friends. You know, as I was talking to Lynn Nofziger, who was a longtime advisor to Ronald Reagan, but he reached out, he chose George W. Bush mainly for political reasons, and yet during those 8 years, it's clear that there was a real bond that was established. And then, as you all have said, he went on to tell funny little stories about the sign that Reagan left outside the Oval Office saying, "Beware of the dog," for the squirrels, and talking about, you know, how did the meeting go with Bishop Tutu, and he said, so-so. I mean, I think I was more touched by President George H.W. Bush than anyone else. It was a very personal eulogy that he gave. It's also interesting that, and I guess we shouldn't be surprised, in each one of the eulogies there was a reference made to Nancy Reagan and the importance she played in his life. And it was Margaret Thatcher who talked about his public achievement being rooted in his personal happiness. And John Danforth talked about that, as well as Brian Mulroney.
And you shouldn't ignore President George W. Bush, who actually chose to talk about the biography of the man more, I think, than the politics. That may have surprised some of us who thought that he might in some subtle way want to link up to Ronald Reagan's politics or philosophy. The line from Bush I want to just mention, his convictions were as strong and straight as these columns of this cathedral. Nice line.
Beautiful line, beautiful speech. John King, you watched as well. Anything stand out in your mind of a surprising note that the president said?
The president's speech, I think, was as Aide said it would be, that he very much wanted to give the history of Ronald Reagan and remind people that this was a very ordinary American who the president said rose to do quite extraordinary things and reshape a country and the world. Also struck as we watched the faces coming out of here, and Jack Danforth, Senator, and Reverend Danforth touched on this, of the generational passing here. Ronald Reagan was president at a time of hugely partisan fights over things like his tax cuts, like the Star Wars program and the military buildup, his standing up to the evil empire. But those partisan politics were conducted in a much more civil way. You had Tip O'Neill as the Speaker of the House. You had the Howard Bakers and the Bob Doles and the Bob Michaels and the Republican side in the Congress. At the end of the day, after these madly partisan fights, they would have a drink and a laugh and sometimes a song. That is very much missing from Washington these days.
Mike Wallace, the veteran CBS News reporter from 60 Minutes, among the journalists who are attending this. We saw our own Bob Novak just walk out a few moments ago himself. Journalists, dignitaries, members of Congress, the military, representatives from around the world have come to Washington, D.C. to pay tribute to Ronald Reagan. Candy Crowley is already out at the Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. The next leg will happen there at sunset, California time, Candy, when the president will be buried.
Absolutely. This is, again, all according to the wishes of the president. He will be buried in a sunset ceremony at his library in Simi Valley, just outside Los Angeles. It's going to shift a little bit. Those who have put together this particular portion of the week-long tributes to Ronald Reagan say that this is the one that they believe will pull at the heartstrings up. Perhaps because first, this will be a smaller crowd, not a small crowd, still about 600 people, but it will be a more intimate service. There will be a solo bagpipe performance of Amazing Grace. We look at the list of those that they expect to come, a partial list of it, and it includes some of those you see here, but mostly this is a West Coast list and in part a Hollywood list. And you will hear some names from old Hollywood: Mr. and Mrs. Kirk Douglas, Mr. and Mrs. Charlton Heston, Mrs. Bob Hope, Mr. and Mrs. Tommy Lasorda, of course, of baseball fame, Norman Lear, also some old Reagan friends, Mrs. Annenberg, Mrs. Bloomingdale, their husbands, all playing a vital part in the early career of Ronald Reagan. Merv Griffin, who was in this Washington ceremony as well. You'll also see some California politicians out here, including the new governor out here, Arnold Schwarzenegger, his wife Maria Shriver. Along with that, there will be other governors, Mr. and Mrs. Pete Wilson, along with the Honorable Richard Riordan, as you know, former mayor of Los Angeles, back to Hollywood, Pat Sajak, Tom Selleck, the Sinatra family. So a different mix of groups. We should also mention, getting back to the special relationship between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, she is going to board that plane with Mrs. Reagan and come here for this sunset service. So this is, of course, the final goodbye for Ronald Reagan. Paula talking earlier about how this is supposed to be an especially hard day for Mrs. Reagan because, of course, this really is the time when the official burial will take place here at the Reagan Library. Wolf?
Thanks, Candy. I want to show our viewers some other pictures from around the country now. Bells will be tolling now around the United States for some time in memory of the former President of the United States. We're looking at these pictures from New York City, but we'll be seeing similar bells being heard around the United States. This is a well-coordinated moment that is part of this state funeral here in the United States. You're looking now at churches, at a church in Milwaukee where these bells will be heard as well. It's part of the symbolic but significant moment that all Americans cherish in trying to understand the former president's legacy right now, any president's legacy, the historic moment that we're experiencing.
It is not surprising to me that we've seen Americans watch the coverage of the president's body traveling from California and then lying in state in the rotunda, and tremendous interest in the state funeral today. Let's listen to the pealing of bells across the country.
These bells are ringing now, not only here in Washington, D.C., but around the United States in memory of Ronald Reagan. These bells, a symbolic gesture, part of this carefully scripted state funeral.
And to give you an idea of what you're going to see if you're with us over the next hour and a half or so, we will at some point be able to show you pictures of the motorcade moving towards the Andrews Air Force Base, where we will share with you the ceremony that will be held there, obviously a much dialed back version of what we saw here at the cathedral. And then later on, when we will watch the plane take off with the president's body, and later on this evening, Wolf and I will be back here at the time the plane lands in California and the body is transferred from Point Mugu to the Presidential Library site in Simi Valley.
Those are the two next major moments, the arrival at Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Washington, D.C. and Maryland, and then the flight clearly to Point Mugu, the Naval Air Station in California, not far from the Presidential Library, where the final interment will, of course, occur. CNN's Tom Foreman was inside the National Cathedral watching all of this unfold, had a good seat inside there. Give us a little bit of the flavor, Tom, what you experienced.
Well, Wolf, I've been in the news business for 27 years, and I must say I've never really experienced anything quite like this. And I guess we have to remember that half of America is not old enough to have seen a presidential funeral like this before. The feeling inside this room as you watch these world leaders from everywhere, something no camera shot can take in. You looked out and you saw the former presidents. You saw the world leaders who had come from all over, both past and present. The sense that this truly was an event that was far beyond the limits of Washington, beyond the limits of America, and truly involved the globe. It was very much upon you throughout this service. Join with that the personal loss. You saw the family there. You saw people who clearly were his friends, not just his colleagues. It gave you a tremendous sense of the weight of a nation, really, and the mourning of a nation at a time like this. It's really quite unprecedented in my experience, at least.
Did you get a sense, Tom, inside that a lot of people were choked up, emotional, crying, or were they as stoic, at least from the wide shots that we saw, as it appeared to be?
I would say that there was one particular moment in this entire gathering here, during the entire service, when President George Bush, the senior, obviously struggled a bit with his emotions over it. I had the feeling that the whole audience for a moment was poised on the edge there, because I think a lot of people had their emotions just below the surface, and that was the moment when they all came forward. He, of course, enormously fond of Ronald Reagan. I visited with him last year at some length, and he said in private exactly the same things he says in public, that he had enormous respect for Ronald Reagan. He liked him as an individual. He liked him as a man. They didn't always agree on everything. We knew that from their campaigns. We knew that from the styles of their presidency. And yet, tremendous personal respect. And as you looked out over this audience, you were aware of how many people from around the world shared some sort of relationship like that with him. Interestingly enough, there were little moments which, again, I'm sure no camera could have caught, but they were fascinating to watch. At the end, as President Bush, current President Bush, left, he stopped briefly to talk to President Clinton for just a moment or two. And then on the way out, he stopped and visited with a few of the other world leaders. And you had the sense of the community of leadership, not just in this nation, but around the world. And that was interesting, because so many people spoke about how Ronald Reagan, even though he had very strong enemies, fostered this sense in person of we can disagree, but we can still treat each other civilly, we can be gentlemen and women, and we can deal with each other fairly. You had the sense that many people here today, from different sides of the aisle and different political perspectives, wanted to pay homage to that in their dealings with each other for this time.
And I think President Bush, the father, made a very direct reference to that when he talked about the cruelty of life in politics and how somehow President Reagan always found civility in a moment. Tom, we also saw, as the ceremony got underway, President Ford putting his hand on President Clinton's shoulders. You mentioned some of the other moments you saw as people were exiting. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us that the camera might not have caught?
Well, I think some of it actually happened before the service. It was really fascinating to watch some of the giants of American politics walking into the audience, greeting each other as old friends, people who they had done great battle with many years ago. You would see these people mixing it up, saying hello. I can't even begin to name all the people that we saw here. You know, from Bob Dole to Al Gore to Mr. Gorbachev to all of these people. And to see them with each other, to see them in community, I think this is something that we very, very often miss as a television audience out in the world, because usually what we see are the news stories where they're going at loggerheads with each other. But the reference in the service to President Reagan and Tip O'Neill sharing time together, to President Reagan and so many other people sharing these moments together when the day was done. I remember last year, as I visited with all of the ex-presidents, except for Mr. Clinton last year, all of them said the same thing. They said when the day was done with Ronald Reagan, he wanted to say to everybody in the room, the day is done. We are now civil people, and we should behave as such with each other. That's something that, again, a lot of news viewers don't really get to see all the time. But when you're at a gathering like this, you're aware of the enormous respect and friendship that exists between many, many people in this country who at any moment you would think can hardly speak to each other.
This reminds me of what we experienced at the dedication of the World War II Memorial just a couple weeks ago, when people were surprised to see how affectionate President Clinton was with the man he beat, George Herbert Walker Bush. A real fraternity.
It certainly is a moment. It's a rare fraternity. The former presidents of the United States, they developed that kind of relationship. Professor Robert Dallek is with us as well, the eminent presidential historian. Professor Dallek, this service in historic perspectives, what does it mean?
Well, Wolf, I also found the sense of shared values, as Judy said before, the pomp and circumstance, the pageantry. It's an American moment. I was also very taken with John Danforth's eulogy, full of the religious imagery, which is such a part of great American political oratory, going back to Abraham Lincoln and William Jennings Bryan, the famous Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic Convention in 1896. There were so many striking historical notes, I think, in this day's pageantry, as I said. And it's a day to remember. And we've had so much in the way of acrimonious politics. And this was a moment of shared values. And Danforth spoke about that, how Ronald Reagan came to office after Vietnam and Watergate, those terrible events of the 1960s and 70s, which tore the country asunder. And then it had a sense of uplift once again. I don't want to be too romantic about it, but there was a kind of bright light and a kind of sunshine that entered into the country's politics and current events. I'm afraid we're back to that kind of divide, and I'm afraid that a week from now we're going to be seeing the same kind of divisive politics that we've experienced in recent years. And so this day will stand out all the more forcefully in people's minds.
It strikes me also that even though this is a ceremony of mourning, there is really something to be grateful for, which is that we had a life lived in full. There are so many moments at the National Cathedral. This is where the memorial service was held for the victims of the September 11th attacks, one of the worst moments in American history. The service for John Kennedy at a Catholic church here in Washington was a service held in the midst of a unbelievable trauma that a 46 or 47-year-old man had been murdered in cold blood. When we've seen ceremonies from Martin Luther King, dead at 38, and Robert Kennedy, dead at 43, and the Oklahoma City victims, it is appropriate to call this a celebration of a life. A man who lived to his 93rd year and accomplished everything he could have done as a mortal human being in his life. That's another reason to look on this day. It's a little dreary outside, but there's a sunny cast to this.
Is the weather, Judy Woodruff, outside improving a little bit now?
Wolf, it is. We are back on the roof of that 8-story, 9-story building we were on before, and it really did get wet as this service was getting underway. You could see that because Mrs. Reagan was with an umbrella as she not only left the Capitol but entered the cathedral. There's a little mist now, but by and large the rain has stopped for a while. It is darkly overcast, but the wind has picked up. There's a chill in the air. And Wolf, if I could just add one point, picking up on what Jeff and Bob Dallek have been saying, we are celebrating a life lived in full, and I know, none of us wants to overdo this point about unity and coming together because, in a few days they'll be back at it. But I do think you get a sense at a time like this of, it's almost as if there's a hunger, a thirst for unity, for togetherness. And even if it only lasts for a few hours or maybe a couple of days, I think Americans long for there to be some bridging of this cavernous gap that has grown between the two political parties. And at one point, the first President Bush said, speaking of Ronald Reagan, he said he was never negative toward his adversaries. He said he was never mean-spirited. And in a way, I took that as a contrast to the politics of today. When you do see mean spirits, you do see negativity, and sometimes I think the American people think it's overboard.
I think that's a fair point, Paula. The service was a religious service, an Episcopalian service. There's no doubt about that, but it went so much further than any specific religious, specific religion, if you will. It was a service that I think all Americans could appreciate.
And that was very carefully calculated, with Rabbi Kushner speaking at the beginning of the ceremony, and many religious leaders of different faiths represented today. I wanted to follow up on a point that Judy was making, because it's a point that we keep on hearing surfacing in interviews with people who waited sometimes 12 hours lined up at the rotunda to pay the respects to the president's body. It wasn't so much did they talk about bridging the gap between Democrats and Republicans. It was the sense that they were depleted coming out of the horror of 9/11 and wanting to share some sort of national experience here. And you're talking not out of grieving so much, but celebration of a life.